So tonight's class will be studying the Torah portion of Bamidbar. Bamidbar is the first Torah portion of the book of Numbers. The book in Hebrew is actually called the book of Bamidbar, the book of in the desert, because the beginning of the Torah portion, and actually the entire book takes place in the desert. Before we begin delving deeply into one of the topics of this week's Torah portion, as we usually do during these classes, we will do a quick overview of the entire Torah portion, and it'll give us a pretty good idea of what the Torah portion is talking about. So the Torah portion of Bamidbar talks about various things, but the bulk of the Torah portion is numbers, a count, a census of the Jewish people in the desert. In the Sinai desert, God says to conduct a census of the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses counts 603,550 men of draftable age, 20 to 60 years. The tribe of Levi, numbering 22,300 males, age 1 month and older, is counted separately. The Levites are to serve in the sanctuary, replacing the firstborn, whose number they approximated, who were disqualified when they participated in the worshiping of the golden calf. The 273 firstborn who lacked a Levite to replace them had to pay a 5 shekel ransom to redeem themselves. Each time the people break camp, the 3 Levite clans dismantle and transport the sanctuary and reassemble it at the center of the next encampment. They then erect their own tents around it. The Kehat family, who carry the sanctuary's vessels, the ark, the menorah, etc., to their specially designed coverings on their shoulders, camp to its south. The Gershonites, in charge of its tapestries and roof coverings, to its west, and the families of Merari, who transport its wall panels and pillars, to its north. Before the sanctuary's entranceway to its east are the tents of Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's son. So that's the way the Jewish people camped in the desert. Whenever they traveled, there was a sign from the Almighty that it's time to pack up and pick up camp. So they would dismantle the entire tabernacle, the traveling temple, world's first mobile home, if you will, and they would carry it. The Levites were split into 3 categories, into 3 families. There were initially 3 brothers and 1 sister. The 1 sister was the mother of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. If you recall, those are kind of the big 3 of the Jewish people at the time in the desert, the leadership positions. Moses was the leader of the Jewish people. Aaron was the high priest, and Miriam was their older sister. No greater leadership position than that. And so their mother, whose name was Yocheved, she was a daughter of Levi, the actual son of Jacob, one of the 12 tribes. And so Levi, he had 4 children, 1 daughter, Yocheved, and then he had 3 sons. The 3 sons were Kahas, that was one name, Gershon was the second son's name, and Merari was the third son's name. And their descendants were all the Levites. And so the Levites were in these 3 families, and each one of these 3 families of Levites had a different job in their service of the tabernacle, which is what we just read here. The Kehat family would carry the vessels of the sanctuary when they traveled. The Gershonites, the Gershon family, they would carry the tapestries and roof coverings when they traveled. And Merari, his family, would transport the panels and the pillars. And so that's how when they rebuilt the tabernacle, when they got that nod from God, so to speak, to reconstruct the tabernacle at a new place, at a new encampment, they would construct it, and then the entire Levite family, the greater Levite family, all those 3 plus Moses, Aaron, and their families, would encamp on the 4 sides of the sanctuary, of the tabernacle. Beyond the Levite circle, the 12 tribes camped in 4 groups of 3 tribes each. To the east are Judah, whose population was 74,600, Yisachar, 54,400, and Zevulun, 57,400. And again, those numbers are, as we explained in the beginning, men of draftable age between 20 and 60 years old. To the south, there were the three tribes of Reuben, 46,500, Shimon, and Gad. Those three tribes camped to the south of the tabernacle. To the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, those three tribes. And to the north, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. This formation is kept also while traveling, each tribe with its own Nasi, prince or leader, and its own flag with its tribal color and emblem. And so that's this week's Torah portion. Lots of numbers, lots of statistics, lots of census numbers. It kind of, to a certain degree, reads like a census. Numbers and more numbers and more numbers, and exactly where they camped in the encampment, or even as they traveled. That's how they traveled. And so tonight, we're going to zero in on this aspect of the census and a unique difference between the census of the greater Jewish population and then the narrow census of the tribe of Levi, who are the priestly tribe. And so we begin with text 1a. Text 1a, a quote from the first three verses of this week's Torah portion. God spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after the exodus from the land of Egypt, saying. So what did God tell Moses to do? Take the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel by families following their fathers' houses, a head count of every male according to the number of their names. From 20 years old and upward, all who are fit to go out to the army in Israel, you shall count them by their legions, you and Aaron. And so our sages tell us that this counting was intended as a form of diamond counting. What do we mean by diamond counting? They say the story, the Rebbe from 1986, every single Sunday, without fail, for a number of hours, beginning after the morning services, which would conclude roughly at about 11 a.m., the Rebbe would stand here in the foyer of 770. This is a picture of one of those times. And the Rebbe would stand there to meet people. And people, all different ages and stages and backgrounds, Jews and non-Jews, would come by and come to the Rebbe for a blessing. The Rebbe would hand out dollar bills, as you can see in this picture. The idea of handing out a dollar bill was the Rebbe once repeated from his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, that whenever two people meet, there should be a mitzvah that is performed, and particularly a mitzvah that benefits a third person. And so the Rebbe would give the individual coming to visit him $1, and that dollar was intended to be given to charity. As a side point, parenthetically, traditionally what people would do is they wouldn't want to give away $1 that they had received from the Rebbe, a blessed dollar, so to speak. And so they would switch it and give a different dollar bill, but the actual dollar bill that they received from the Rebbe, they would keep it. I personally have a number of dollars that I received from the Rebbe. And so the Rebbe would stand for hours on end, as we can see in this picture. That day, the Rebbe began. This is a picture roughly 1990. This is a picture, as you can see on the clock, it is 2:40. The Rebbe started that day roughly at about 11 o'clock. So it's almost 4 hours later, and the Rebbe was standing on his feet, and the Rebbe was well into his ninth decade at the time, and the Rebbe didn't take a break, would never take a break. And sometimes up to 8 hours, the Rebbe would just stand handing out blessings and dollars, and all types of people would come visit the Rebbe. And so an older woman who was going by the Rebbe had the audacity and said, Rebbe, how is it possible? How do you not grow tired of standing there on your feet at such an age, just every Sunday over and over again? And the Rebbe responded, every soul is a diamond. Can one grow tired of counting diamonds? And so this is what our sages tell us, what God was doing in the desert, counting the Jewish people. Ultimately, God didn't need to count the Jewish people. God knew their number. But the Midrash tells us that this wasn't just a count to know their census. This was a counting of diamonds. Text 1b. For those who have the book, it's on page 86. See how dear the Jewish people are to God. They are his legions, and he wishes to count them frequently. Like one who constantly counts a precious treasure again and again to know how much it contains and experiences joy over it every time. God similarly would rejoice every time he recalled the number of the Jewish people, saying, I have this number of legions in my world who carry out my will. God takes comfort in them. So the count of the Jewish people, as we mentioned, was 603,550. Those were from the 12 tribes, excluding one. Now, when we say 12 tribes, we all know that Jacob had 12 sons, and so there were 12 tribes. But in reality, there were 13 tribes. Why 13 tribes? Because in reality, the 13 tribes were the 12 sons of Jacob, but one of his sons was split into. Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and Jacob blessed Joseph that he will get a double portion amongst his brothers, amongst the other tribes. And so Manasseh and Ephraim are counted as kind of sub-tribes within Joseph, but they are considered tribes in their own right. So instead of the 12 sons of Jacob, there are 13 tribes, 11 sons of Jacob, and Manasseh and Ephraim, two of his grandsons, in place of Joseph. So 13 tribes. But in that count of 603,550, it was a census of only 12 of the 13. It was excluding the Levite tribe. As the verse tells us in this week's portion, the sum of all those who were counted, says the verse, 603,550. But the Levites, says the verse, according to their father's tribe, were not numbered among them. Why weren't they? God spoke to Moses, saying, only the tribe of Levi shall you not number, and you shall not reckon their sum among the children of Israel. Why weren't they counted together with everyone else? So our favorite commentary, Rashi Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki, the famed 12th century sage, 11th, 12th century sage, French sage, tells us, only the tribe of Levi you shall not number. Why? The legion of the king deserves to be counted on its own. Another explanation, the Holy One, blessed be he, foresaw that a decree was destined to be enacted against all those counted from 20 years and upward, condemning them to die in the desert. He said, let these not be included, for they are mine, since they did not err with the sin of the golden calf. You see, the tribe of Levi were this unique tribe. They weren't a tribe like everyone else. They weren't the same tribe like Dan or Gad or any other tribe. They were a very unique tribe. They were God's tribe. They were committed to do what God wanted from them. And therefore, because they were committed to do what God wanted from them, when the story of the golden calf came, they were the only tribe that not a single member of the tribe participated in the sin of the golden calf. And so God said that, these are my people. This is my legion. This is the kind of secret service detail of the king. This is the king's. This is God's personal detail. The Levites, they will serve in the temple. They're my priests. And so they deserve to be counted along. But even more than that, because they did not earn the golden calf, that's why a period of time later, when the Jewish people sinned with the story of the spies, as we will get to in a number of weeks, and the entirety of the Jewish population was condemned to death between the ages of 20 and 60. On their 60th birthday, they would pass, which is why the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years, to enable that all those who were 20 years old at the time of the sin of the spies had passed before they entered the land of Israel. And so when they entered the land of Israel, there was no one who was older than 60, except for, amongst the men that is, except for the Levites, because the Levites were not part of that punishment. And because they weren't part of the punishment, said God, because they are this unique legion, they get counted on their own. They get counted separately. And that's why The verse tells us later on in this week's Torah portion, text 3, God spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert, saying, count the sons of Levi according to their father's house, according to their families. Count all males from the age of 1 month and upward. So Moses counted them according to God's word, just as he was commanded. And this brings us to the specific topic of tonight's class. If you notice a small difference in the introductory verses of this week's Torah portion, it tells us that the Jewish people were counted from the age of 20 to 60. Whereas when it comes to the Levites, the verse tells us that they were counted from the age of 1 month and upward. Why that difference? Now, parenthetically, you'll notice here it says it was Moses counted them according to God's word, which is a unique wording of the verse. And so our sages point out an interesting episode that took place when Moses was counting the Jewish people. Here it goes from the Midrash text 4. One day I'll figure out where to put this little box. Okay, text 4. Moses counted them according to God's word. Says the Midrash, Moses said to the Holy One, blessed be he, you are telling me to count them from 1 month of age. Can I possibly go and loiter around their courtyards and their homes and count every single one of them, as you have said, count all males from the age of 1 month and upward? What do you want me to be? The nosy guy who goes into everyone's tent to see if they have a baby, if they don't have a baby, start asking so many questions, getting them to come out. What exactly do you want me to do? How do you expect me to do this? So God said, you do your part, I'll do mine. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi ben Reb Shalom said, Moses would go and stand by the entrances to their tents of the Levites, and the Shekhinah, the divine presence, would draw near and say, there are 5 infants in this home, 5 infants in this home, and 10 infants in this home. This is what the verse means when it says Moses counted them according to God's word, literally by God's word. Moses didn't have to do much. He went in front of every house. There emerged this sound, this divine sound that said exactly how many children were in that home. And so when the verse tells us that it was by the word of God, it was literally by the word of God. So that's how Moses did this census. It worked out fine. But the question still stands. Why? Why the difference between the census of the Jewish people, the majority of the Jewish people, which was from the age of 20 to the age of 60, and that was because it was a military draft, and so it was numbers of people who were able to serve in the military, and you can't serve in the military under the age of 20. So God says. When it comes to the Levites, as a matter of fact, later on, by the count of the Levites, there's a second count of the Levites. And in that second count of the Levites, the verse tells us that the count were from the Levites who are the ages between the ages of 30 and 50. Why the ages of 30 and 50? Because the Levites had tough work. They had tough jobs. The jobs of the Levites, as we mentioned in the introduction, the job of the Levites, depending on which family they were, either they had to carry the furnishings, which were very heavy, solid wood, gold, it was heavy furnishings, or they had to carry the beams and the walls of the tabernacle, or they had to carry the tapestries, were these thick, heavy, numerous tapestries. And so it was no small feat. It was a big job. It was a heavy job. There was a schlepping them, there was dismantling, there was rebuilding. And so the verse tells us that the Levites worked only from the age of 30 to the age of 50. Which begs the question, if when it comes to counting them for their work, they're counted from the ages of 30 and 50, then why the need for the census of the Levites from the age of 30 days, from the age of 1 month? In text 5, we read the verse where it speaks about Gershon, the Gershonite's job in the service of the temple. And this is the reason why there was a census, to find out how many able-bodied men they had to carry out this labor. God spoke to Moses, saying, take a census of the sons of Gershon, of them too, following their fathers' houses according to their families. From the age of 30 years and upward until the age of 50 years, you shall count them, all who come to join the legion to perform service in the tent of meeting. This is the service of the Gershon families, to serve and to carry. They shall carry the curtains of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting, its coverings, and the tachash skin covering overlaid upon it, and the screen for the entrance to the tent of meeting. The hangings of the courtyard, the screen at the entrance of the gate of the courtyard, which is around the tabernacle, the altar, the ropes, all the work involved, and everything that is made from them, and thus shall they serve. And so what was the point of the counting? And so the verse continues with the Merari family and the Kahas family. So the purpose of the counting of the Levites from the age of 30, as well as counting from all the other tribes from the age of 20, it makes sense. It was to find out how many able-bodied men were there for the military and how many able-bodied men were there for the service of the temple. Which strengthens our question even more. Why was it necessary to have a count of the Levites from such a young age? In other words, what service was there for these children of only 1 month and upward? And why start from a month? If you're already starting, start from day 1. Starting from a month, maybe start from 6 months, maybe 9 months. And so if it's in the context of service, these countings are all in context of service. What type of service is there for the babies amongst the Levites that they were counted from 1 month? Now, there are various answers that are given throughout the ages by different sages, and we're going to focus once again on the answer provided by our favorite commentary, Rashi, the French 12th century sage Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki. And he explains as follows. Why was it important to count them from such a young age? And why start at 30 days and not earlier? Text 6, page 92. From the age of 1 month and upward, that's when the Levites are counted. Why from 1 month? When he is no longer in the category of possible premature birth. He is counted among those called keepers of the holy charge. Just to explain that a little bit before we continue. According to Jewish law, in certain areas, a child is not considered fully alive. Obviously, the child's alive from the first moment, and we're not going to get into the abortion discussion. It's an entirely different aspect of it. But the child isn't considered fully, I guess alive isn't the correct term, but isn't fully out of the danger of premature death until the child reaches 30 days. It's very rare, says the Talmud, but it is a possible occurrence that under 30 days, the child can still pass away. And in those days, it was very much more common, as we spoke for those who joined the Mashiach class, about the mortality rates of under the age of 5 used to happen a lot more often, but in the Talmud, it discusses it up to the day 30, which is why, parenthetically, when it comes to Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn, it's performed on the 30th day. Why on the 30th day? Because we want to ensure that the child is a full month old and he survived, so to speak, that full month before we go ahead and perform the Pidyon Haben, and that's a statement in the verse. And so that's what's mentioned here, that over here, in other words, ideally, the Levites would have been counted from day 1. An infant just 1 day old would have been counted for the legion of God, as we're calling it here. But because technically we wait until the 30 days, so it's considered day one when we count them from day 30. But what happens once they're a month old? Which is in turn as if it's their first day of being alive. They're now counted amongst those called keepers of the holy charge. This infant, who's only 30 days old, is called a keeper of the holy charge. Rashi continues. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Shalom, said, that tribe, the tribe of Levi, is accustomed to being counted from the womb. As it says, whom she bore to Levi in Egypt. As she entered the gate of Egypt, Yocheved, Moses' mother, was born, yet Yocheved was counted as one of the 70 souls. For if you count their total, you find only 69, and it was she who completed the number. What does that mean? What Rashi is telling us is that in essence, these young children, there is a service that they can perform. Even at 1 month old, the newborns are called keepers of the holy charge. And he uses the story of Yocheved as a backup. What was the story of Yocheved? Yocheved was the 70th child when Jacob descended to Egypt, following his son Joseph, who had become the viceroy many, many years earlier, roughly 300 years to 250 years before this story took place. The verse tells us, and we'll dwell on it a little bit later at length. The verse tells us that Yocheved was born at the gates entering Egypt. At that border, entering Egypt, Yocheved was born, and she completed the tally of 70 souls. Because the verse tells us that there were 70 souls that descended to Egypt, but if you count the names, there's only 69 names. And Yocheved isn't amongst those names because when they left Israel, they were only 69. But once they entered Egypt, as they entered Egypt, Yocheved was born, completing the tally of 70. How old was she then when she completed the tally of 70? A newborn. She was just born. As a matter of fact, they're referred to 70 as 70 even before she was born, while she's still in the womb. And so, in a sense, this presents more of a question than of an answer. All right, you want to write the story of Yocheved, and we see that the tribe of Levi, being Yocheved was Moses' mother, she was from the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi, they have this association with being counted at a young age. So God wanted that the tribe of Levi should be counted from a young age, even as newborns, infants. But what does Rashi say in the beginning? That first statement, he tells us that at age 1 month, there is a service for them. They are keepers of the holy charge. Really? Didn't we just establish that the Levites have to be 30 years old to service? How can they do some sort of service, keepers of the holy charge? And how on earth are they keepers of the holy charge, this charge that was charged by them by God to service the temple? How are they keepers of the holy charge? And while we're asking questions, why is this entire story of Yocheved that important? How does this story of Yocheved, and at such length, Rashi usually is very concise, at such length, this whole almost analytical aspect of the story with the numbers, 69, counted, it's only 69, really there were 70. Why is that important for this aspect to understand why the Levites were counted from age 30, especially in association with service? So to understand this, we have to understand what exactly is the job of the Levites in the temple, and what does it mean, keepers of the holy charge? What are keepers of the holy charge? What was this holy charge? What was the service of the tabernacle? This is an interesting painting over here. I guess it gives us some sort of a visual of what the temple courtyard looked like. This is the outer courtyard. This is the altar. And back here on the top right corner is just a part of the actual sanctuary of the tabernacle itself. Right in front of it was a washing basin known as the kior. And these were the tents of the Levites, who were immediately adjacent to the north, south, east, and west sides of the courtyard, outer of which was the tents of the Jewish people. And so what exactly was this charge that the Levites had to do? So we'll look in this week's Torah portion, the book of Numbers, text 7, page 93. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, over all its vessels, and over all that belongs to it. They shall carry the tabernacle, and they shall minister to it, and they shall encamp around the tabernacle. When the tabernacle is set to travel, the Levites shall dismantle it, and when the tabernacle camps, the Levites shall erect it. Any outsider, non-Levite, who approaches shall be put to death. It's not their job. They're not allowed to. It's a holy job. It's only for the Levites. An outsider, another Jew who's not from the tribe of Levi, is not allowed to. The children of Israel shall encamp, each man by his own camp, and each man by his division, each one by their tribe. The Levites shall encamp, the verse continues, around the tabernacle of the testimony, so that, why are they encamping around the tabernacle of the testimony? So the verse tells us, so that there will be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel, and the Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. And the children of Israel did according to all that God had commanded Moses, thus did they do. So if we look at these verses, it gives us a different understanding of what the charge of the Levites were. It wasn't just a single charge. This job description had a number of things that was associated with it, not just the erection and dismantling of the tabernacle. They had the responsibility of the tabernacle and its contents. They had the job of dismantling it and erecting it between travels. But then they also had this unique job that's right in the middle of this quote, and that was to camp around the tabernacle, the Mishkan, while it was in the desert. And what was the purpose of that camping around it? It ensures a certain additional measure of protection to ensure that no outsider shall approach it. That was the job. And as a matter of fact, this job extended not only when they were in the desert, but even once the temple, King Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, it was a magnificent edifice. They still had that job of posting guards around the temple. As we see here, text 8 from Maimonides, the descendants of Levi were singled out for service in the sanctuary. As the verse states, at that time, God separated the tribe of Levi. It is a positive commandment. What is the commandment? For the Levites to be free and prepared for the service of the sanctuary, whether they desire to do so or not, as the verse states, and the Levite shall perform the service of the tent of meeting. When a Levite accepts all the mitzvot of the Levites with the exception of one matter, he is not accepted unless he accepts them all. What is this service? Maimonides continues. Their service was to guard the temple. Among the Levites, there were gatekeepers who would open the gates of the temple and close its doors, and there were singers who would accompany the sacrifices with a song each day. The latter concept is derived from the verse, and he shall serve them in the name of God his Lord, as all of his Levite brethren. Which service involves invoking the name of God? I would say song. So what we see here from Maimonides is the beginning of the second paragraph is that one of the primary jobs of the Levites was guarding the temple. Now, this guard wasn't so much guarding to ensure that no intruder enters the temple. It was more of an honor guard. It was a magnificent building. It was one that was a dwelling place for the Almighty. It's befitting for something so magnificent to have this constant 24/7 honor guard around it. And so not just in the desert, but even the temple had this guarding of the Levites, which also served the purposes we saw in the verse earlier to ensure that no outsider would breach that surrounding. My understanding is that it wasn't something that they were guards kind of on guard threatening people. It was kind of a notice, a warning sign. Here's the Levites. You can't go past the Levites because that's where the temple is, and outsiders are not allowed in the temple. And so that was the job description of the temple and the Levites: dismantling the tabernacle, re-erecting it, carrying it, and guarding the tabernacle. So now the question is there any part of this service that young children can take part of? I guess this third picture here is a better visual, actually, of the temple, the courtyard in the desert. This is how they encamped. Here's the Levites immediately adjacent to the courtyard. That is the tabernacle, the altar, and then on the outside were the tents of the Jewish people. A lot more tents that are shown here in this diagram, this script art here, but it gives us a general idea. Either way, is there any part of this work that a 30-day-old, a newborn, will be able to participate in? And there must be, because the verse tells us that they were counted from 30 days old, and they were called keepers of the charge. In other words, one of these aspects. As a matter of fact, there is. And what is that? This idea of camping around the tabernacle to be warning, as an honor guard for the tabernacle. Doesn't say an age, doesn't need an age of the Levites. If there's a family of Levites, every member of that family, even a newborn, is fulfilling his charge. Even at the age of 30 days old, is part of the keeper of that charge to guard the temple, to be part of that honor guard. Even a 30-day-old. As we explained, it's not necessarily a 30-day-old. The purpose of 30 is to express the idea as a newborn, right from the get-go. In the words of the Rebbe, text 9, keepers of the holy charge refers to the fact that the Levites guarded the Mishkan so that no stranger would approach it. As the verse says, the Levites shall keep the charge of the Mishkan of the testimony. This was the purpose of the commandment: the Levites shall encamp around the Mishkan of the testimony. Therefore, Levites can be called keepers of the holy charge already from 1 month of age and up, because by camping, by simply being present around the Mishkan of the testimony, newborn Levites are in fact keepers of the holy charge, even if they aren't yet ready for the work of actually guarding the Mishkan. Just by being in existence, they're already fulfilling their holy charge of guarding the temple. And so that is a job that is associated with being a Levite, even from such a young age. By not doing anything, just by being there. And that's why the Levites were counted from such a young age. That's why the Levites are counted from even 1 month. Because there was something for even newborns to participate in their service. Now that we understand how the Levites can be part of their service even from such a young age, now we can go back to the Rashi commentary. If you recall that Rashi in his commentary explaining why it began from 1 month, quoted that story from when the Jewish people descended to Egypt from Israel, that Yocheved, Moses' mother, completed the tally of 70. So we'll get to that story and we'll see what that adds to our understanding of this conundrum, and really, most importantly, what this entire idea can teach each one of us. Here's a quote back to the story in the end of the book of Genesis when Jacob and his family are leaving Israel and coming into Egypt. All the souls, after it gives an entire count of the names of his children and his grandchildren, all the souls coming to Egypt with Jacob, those descended from him, and so excluding the wives of Jacob's sons, all the souls were 66. And Joseph's sons, who were born to him in Egypt, 2 souls. So there's 66 plus Joseph, plus 2 of his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. The verse concludes, all the souls of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. Hold it. Fuzzy math over here. There were 66. There's Joseph, 67. And there's Manasseh and Ephraim, 68, 69. So why does it say that they're all 70? And so that's why we have what we mentioned earlier, what we quoted from Rashi, this idea that what made them 70 was Yocheved. And she wasn't just one of the 70. She was number 70. Had she been born before entering Egypt, she would have been one of 70. But the fact that she was born on the border, in the entranceway of Israel, had she been born in Israel, she would have been one of the 70, not number 70. But here she was number 70. She completed the tally as they entered Egypt. Why is that so important? Why is number 70 so significant? And we see number 70 throughout Jewish literature, throughout the Torah. We find number 70 constantly. There were 70 elders in the desert. The Midrash tells us that there are 70 valid ways or perspectives of understanding of the Torah, of every aspect of Torah. There are 70 holy days on the Jewish calendar between Shabbos and the holidays. And God has 70 different names, which are really expressions of his essence. So 70 is key in Judaism. But there's another important 70, which is the most important in relation to Jacob's sojourn from Israel to Egypt. And that is, there are 70 nations in the world, aside from the Jewish people. Now, if you look at the UN, right, there's 193, I think, on last count, 196, 205. If you take in all the political debates around the world, there's probably 215 countries, right? So why do we say there are 70 nations? There are 70 nations because we're not talking about political boundaries or languages or countries in the world, which, as we mentioned in the UN, there are close to 200. What we're talking about are the 70 original clans that emerged from Noah after the flood. Noah had 70 descendants. Each one was the patriarch of a nation. And each one of these nations all got along until the Tower of Babel. But once there was the Tower of Babel, and there was that destruction of it, and the destruction that God brought, that everyone dispersed, each one became independent with their own language, their own culture, and their own location. Those 70 clans are the general 70 nations from which all other nations come from. And so when the Torah refers to the nations of the world, it calls them the 70 nations. That's why this number 70 is important. Like we see here, text 11 from one of the earliest sages, the 13th century sage, Rabbeinu Bachya, explains as follows. Until the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, all the inhabitants of the earth spoke one language, Hebrew, the language God used to create the world. Now that they had sinned, their languages were mixed up, and it ended up happening that the 70 branches of Noah's family were divided into 70 nations, each with its own language. As we know, there are 70 spiritual ministers guiding the 70 nations below. Each spiritual minister is the basis for its particular nation and language. So what does this have to do with Jacob? When Jacob descended into Egypt, it wasn't just a technical issue that they were relocating temporarily because it was a famine in Israel, and so they had to go to Egypt. This was about the Jewish nation beginning its foray into the international scene to transform the international scene and elevate it to a place of holiness. This was the beginning of the Jewish people's mission to uplift the entire world and make it a dwelling place for God. This is where it all began, with Jacob descending with his family from Israel to Egypt. And so there were 70 of the Jewish people to contend with the 70 nations. Kind of a match to those forces of the 70 nations were the 70 members of Jacob's family. In the words of the Zohar, text 11b, Rabbi Chia was sitting before Rabbi Shimon and said, "Why did the Torah see fit to count the sons of Jacob? As the verse states, all the souls of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. And why 70 and no more?" Rabbi Shimon replied, the number 70 corresponds to the 70 nations of the world. The Jewish people were one nation facing all the rest. But they were facing all the rest because they had this mission. And this mission was to uplift the entire world and to reveal the divine to the entire world, to all 70 nations. What's the point of all this whole background, text 11a and b? Who was the one that completed that mission? Who was the one that was able to complete the number 70, that tally? It was accomplished by Yocheved, Moses' mother. She was the one that accomplished that completion to enable the elevation of the entire world. She was that final piece of the puzzle that enabled the Jewish people to contend with the 70 nations of the world. The words are there, but text 12. By mentioning the fact that all the souls of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70, the Torah emphasizes their completeness. 70 reflects the completeness of the entire Jewish people. By bringing them to the number 70, Yocheved, she and no one else, made the entire house of Jacob. In other words, what Rashi is expressing by quoting this story and its details is telling us this important idea that we see by the Levites, not just by Yocheved. She's the one who began this trend, that just by being born, just by her very existence as an infant, as a newborn, she changed the tide of history. She caused that the entire Jewish people were now complete and able to fulfill their mission in making the world a better place. And so to every single Levite. That's what Rashi is expressing by bringing this aspect of Yocheved. As Rashi states, that tribe is accustomed to being counted from the womb. Already from birth, they have the ability to effect completion in the entire house of Jacob. Therefore, they can already be counted from the age of 1 month, and they can also be called keepers of the holy charge, something necessary for the entire Jewish people. What's this got to do with us? What this has to do with us is as follows. The Levites may seem like something which is abstract. I'm not a Levite. You're not a Levite. I don't believe anyone on this class is a Levite. So what does this have to do with us? Maimonides teaches us something very important. Text 14. The laws of the Levites, yes, on a literal sense, are just for the Levites. But on a spiritual sense, anything which speaks about a Levite is applied to each individual as well, not just a Levite. The words of Maimonides. Not only the tribe of Levi is holy, rather it can be for anyone in the world, Jew or non-Jew, whose spirit generously motivates him and has the insight to set himself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister to him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, removing from his neck the yoke of the many reckonings that people seek, is sanctified as holy of holies. God will be his portion and heritage forever, and will provide what is sufficient for him in this world, like he provides for the priests and the Levites. And so each one of us has this responsibility to actually be a Levite. And we have this merit that we can, each one of us, be a Levite. We have that in us. What does it mean to be a Levite? To recognize this idea that every single one of us is a crucial component of the mission to make the world a better place. It's not just someone who's a great rabbi, someone who's a great leader, an author, a thinker, someone who's been religious all their life. Those are all excuses. Every single one of us, every single one of the next generation, every child is of absolute importance, just as the greatest leader, because it's through them that the mission is completed. And we'll finish off with text 15, which the Midrash tells us a fascinating behind-the-scenes story that took place when it came to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, which we'll be celebrating next week, Sunday evening. Related to this point, Rabbi Meir said when the Jews stood before Sinai to receive the Torah, God said to them, I swear I will not give you the Torah unless you provide worthy guarantors who will assure that you will observe its laws. The Jews responded, Master of the world, our forefathers will be our guarantors. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're the guarantors that will fulfill the Torah. God said, no, your guarantors themselves require guarantors. Master of the world, the Jews exclaimed, our prophets will be our guarantors. I have grievances against them too, God replied. As the verse states, the shepherds have rebelled against me. God concluded, bring proper guarantors, and only then will I give you the Torah. The Jewish people responded, they said, our children will serve as our guarantors. They truly are worthy guarantors, God replied. Because of them, I will give the Torah. We receive the Torah only because of the youth. We receive the Torah only because of the next generation. And so next time we see a child, the next time we see a Jewish child, and we think that the child is, oh, it's just a child, it's not important for this, it's not important for that. It's important that we recognize the value of each and every single individual, especially each and every child. There are crucial components of the completion of the Jewish nation, a crucial component for the fulfillment of the mission. And when it comes now leading up to the reading of the Torah on Shavuot, Jewish children are a crucial component of Shavuot, which is why it's important for every single person to come and hear the reading of the Ten Commandments as if we're receiving them for the first time at Mount Sinai. Every single man, woman, child, it's crucial for everyone to come and hear the Torah, hear the Ten Commandments as if it's given for the first time at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And so if we're looking to invest in the continuity of Judaism, it starts with every single Jewish child.